Okay, here we are. Good morning, everyone, and good evening, good afternoon. It's a really great pleasure to see all these people today. My name is Stefania Manfio, and I am a PhD student, a PhD candidate here in the Department of Anthropology at Stanford. And before starting, I would like to acknowledge that the Stanford University sits on the ancestral and unceded land of Ekama Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance of the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values in community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. So together with the Professor Graham Parker and supported by the Stanford Global Studies, we are hosting this seminar series called Reframing Enslaved Past, a series of 6 seminars running throughout February and May. And the first series can already be found on the Stanford Global Studies YouTube channel. Why are we doing this? Big data approaches to the study of enslavement already boast many digital projects and websites among these. And the Atlantic will predominate by far, with other regions such as the Indian Ocean still relatively neglected. The goal of our series is to bring well-established projects into contact with the newer ones. Presenters have been asked to address the following questions. So here, what are the scholarly goals and the opportunity? Please, we ask everyone to mute themselves. How can I, let's see.
Imperativo, you should talk. Sí, habla. Tú habla.
I think, Vincent, please, can you, let's see. Okay, sorry. So where we are. Okay, the presenter have been asked to address the following questions. What are the scholarly goals and the opportunities driving your research project? What are the affordances and challenges involved in your chosen approach? How would you characterize your use of databases? With these questions, we aim to facilitate a discussion about the critical data practices around enslaved past, focusing on methodologies. Additionally, this series will have brainstormed for one new initiative started by Professor Parker, entitled the Early Cape Portal, in which our research group seeks to understand the early colonial Cape of Good Hope in relation to the Indian Ocean labor diaspora that helped create it. The seminar series is founded by Stanford Global Studies, which aim to archive the talks from its YouTube channel, and I hope each of you is okay with that. The series brings together 2 recent initiatives, the Aftermath of Slavery workshop run by Jane Campbell and Graham Parker, and supported by the Center for Comparative Studies of Race and Ethnicity, and Seston's ongoing Critical Data Practices workshop. We hope this series will engage not only scholars, but also heritage practitioners working on histories and the archaeologies of enslavement and other kinds of labor diaspora, and especially those pursuing comparative studies of Indian Ocean, Atlantic, and other systems, those committed to public-facing humanities, those interested in digital humanities and critical data practices. We also seek to compare big data projects with more humanistically based ones. Today, we are delighted that Professor Johan Fourie, Kate Ekama, and Kathryn Smith will present in our second workshop. Now, I give the floor to Professor Parker to introduce the speakers. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you very much, Stefania. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers in the order of their speaking. Johan Fourie is professor in the Department of Economics at Stellenbosch University, where he teaches economic and quantitative history. He is coordinator of the Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past, acronym LEAP, and principal investigator of the Biography of an Uncharted People project. And if I may at a personal note, if I had had $1 or even a rand for every time I've been asked if I had made the acquaintance of Professor Fourie, I would be a wealthy person now. His first book, Our Long Walk to Economic Freedom, appeared in 2021, a product of the pandemic, it turns out. Bridge building between social, scientific, and historical work is very much in the character of his work, I think, and I very much look forward to hearing more about his work and the many projects and the publications with which he has been involved. His website, for example, is a wonderfully quirky and engaging, but I think even that doesn't give a full range of his activities and interests. Kate Ekama is a postdoctoral researcher at Stellenbosch University. Her work focuses on slavery in the Indian Ocean world, primarily in the Cape and in Sri Lanka, spanning the 17th to 19th centuries. Kate's current project, Capitalizing on Emancipation, explores the financial underpinnings of slavery in the 19th century Cape Colony. She's affiliated to LEAP. I was very excited to come across her essay and editorship in a fascinating collection, The Emancipation of the Enslaved in the Cape Colony, recently. What happened to the formerly enslaved in the short and medium term? Third of today's speakers, Kathryn Smith is an interdisciplinary visual artist, curator and forensic imaging specialist, and currently the chair of the Department of Visual Arts at Stellenbosch University. Kathryn's PhD is in forensic art. Kathryn is a director of Viz Lab. I don't know if you pronounce it that way, VIZ.lab, a studio and lab working on the interface of art, science, and technology and supporting inter-institutional collaboration. Just that sounds music to our ears, if I may add another medium to the expression. As a teacher, Kathryn promotes practice-oriented research and the integration of art design and theory and social engagement. Thank you very much. I will put into the chat the wonderful websites of all of today's speakers. So thank you very much. Shall I hand it over to you, Johan?
Thanks, Grant, and thanks for that very kind and generous introduction. I'm sharing my screen, and I hope that you can see what I see. Certainly, I think the feeling is a bit mutual that if I had $1 for every time, and in this case, $1 would be better for every time I've been told to meet up with you, then I would certainly also be pretty affluent. So it's wonderful to have been invited to present here today. My part will be a short introduction into the Biography of an Uncharted People project that we've been running for the last 5 years at Stellenbosch University. It's a project affiliated to our history department. And so that was already kind of a big interdisciplinary leap for me. But it's a project also that I should mention funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and a very generous grant that they have provided to us. What it entails basically is an attempt to write a history of people that are typically excluded from the conventional archival sources. So we know that no archive can be complete, and therefore no history is ever fully written. Often, as I'm sure many of you would have found in your own research, the archives tend to preserve records of the privileged or the powerful, and therefore the kind of histories that we can write with those sources are likely to be partial. And certainly in our continent, this is true for a variety of reasons, but partly also due to the accessibility of many archival sources on the continent, and certainly because of a colonial history. So economic historians, and this is my domain, my PhD was in economic history, and what I in a history department, I should add, and what I had noticed when I started doing the PhD was that many of the historians, the economic historians in that department, was using microdata, individual level or household level records that tell stories of people that we typically would not find in the kind of conventional sources, historical sources that we would use, like letters or journals or diaries, reports, these kinds of things. And so this can be all kinds of administrative microdata, things like marriage records, things like death notices. And what I soon realized is that you can do more with these records than just try and write or rewrite economic history. You can write all kinds of history with an analysis of these large administrative data sets. And so that's really what the purpose of the Biography of an Uncharted People project is to firstly transcribe large historical administrative data sets for South Africa, and in particular the Cape Colony, and then analyze this. So equip students with the tools, and there are many of these tools, as I'm sure many of you are aware, that are now relatively freely accessible and can help understand or analyze the information in these microdata. So there are 5 project themes as part of the bigger project. We've classified, given them sexy titles like Love and Marriage in the Mother City, Democracy and Disenfranchisement. Kate heads up the Capitalizing on Emancipation theme, and so she will talk specifically to that. There's a Frontiers of Finance project, which looks specifically at limited liability company records. So here it is, one of the students, for example, looks at the types of corruption between civil servants and kind of private industry that we observe in the late 19th century. Democracy and Disenfranchisement, I should mention, is based on voter rolls and a host of other kinds of records of the late 19th century Cape as well. And then Life and Death in South Africa is kind of a broader theme where we specifically look at death notices. So I've highlighted 2 here, the 1st and the 5th theme, and I'll just give you some sense of the kind of results that have emerged from our research. And then, as I said, Kate will talk about the 3rd theme. So one of the earlier papers that we worked on was to kind of firstly analyze marriage records. Now, on its own, a marriage record is not that interesting or exciting, but we have analyzed around 55,000 of these records, and actually we've got many more, but specifically this paper looks at Anglican Cape Town. And what is recorded in these marriage records are, of course, the name of the husband and the wife and the occupations and age and these kind of things, but also in the South African records we have race included. And so we can actually calculate from these records, or analyze actually these records, to understand the extent of interracial marriages in Cape Town. Now, there's of course a big literature on interracial marriages, and there's most famously the prohibition on the Mixed Marriages Act in 1949. But what we didn't really know was the extent, because this was never quantified before. And so this paper really just shows the time trend. And this graph, of course, shows this time trend of the extent of interracial marriages. And what is certainly surprising to me, although I must admit that I knew initially the literature pretty badly, was the size, the scale of interracial marriages in Cape Town. And you can see that it, at the beginning of the 20th century, was almost close to 10% of all marriages. And you can also then clearly see the decline in the 1920s specifically. So by the 1930s, actually, we see a much lower percentage, almost like 2.5%, and that falls almost to 0 after the enactment of the Prohibition Act. And so that's really kind of an interesting way of just analyzing trends across time using these kinds of microdata. A second one, which I thought was kind of interesting, not always entirely sure exactly how to interpret this, or I guess one way to think about this kind of analysis is that it actually exposes more questions rather than the kind of giving answers to existing questions. So here is a series also using the marriage records of wedding seasonality. So those lines, we have two race groups here, the colored population in South Africa and the white population of Cape Town. And what you see basically is the seasonality of the weddings, the absolute number of weddings per season, right? So autumn, spring, summer, and winter. And then you see something curious happening basically around the end of the Second World War. And that is that summer weddings become much more popular than the rest. So there was almost no difference between the different seasons before 1945, but somehow after 1945, we see the splits. And the question is like, why did this happen? So there's clearly something that is happening that makes summer holidays more popular. It might be that, you know, suddenly kind of there's a spring break or a Easter break, but that seems also to kind of pair mostly with spring rather than with summer. So something about the kind of cultural institutions in Cape Town change around this time, and it seems to be the case for both white and colored marriages. And then the final one I'll just kind of mention is actually a master's student that worked on this, Laura Richardson, where she matched the marriage records to baptism records. And the purpose thereof was to calculate bridal pregnancy. So basically how many women were pregnant on the day of their wedding. And again, you know, there are obvious literatures which talk about the you know, the way that romantic relationships was conducted during this time. A lot of the writing that you find in the archives are typically from church ministers with obviously a very specific, you know, intention and bias in those. But when you analyze these kind of matches, and this is what Laura did, you find that actually, you know, about 30% of children born, first-born children, were conceived before the wedding day, which clearly suggests a very different picture, or paints a very different picture than what the kind of literature that we could find suggested. And so that obviously varies by the different parishes. And so you, on the left-hand side, you'll see the different parish names. So you know, Sea Point would be 13% compared to Athlone, which would be 38%. But still, you see quite a large percentage of weddings, births within 7 months after the wedding day. And so again, how microdata helps us understand perhaps a part of life in the early 20th century that we would never have had access to otherwise, right? And especially also of people that typically wouldn't have recorded diaries, letters, to talk about these kinds of things and preserve them in the archive. The second set that I want to talk about is life and death, the second theme. And that is a paper that I worked with Jonathan Jays, who was a master's student here in economics, where we looked, of course, with COVID arriving, there was a lot of attention towards the Spanish flu. We had actually started working on Spanish flu data, fortunately for us, already 2 years earlier when it was the centenary celebration. Well, celebration is probably not the right, centenary of the Spanish flu. And what we did was basically transcribe about 40,000 of these death notices. And again, civil registrations in the Cape was actually quite comprehensive. Of course, there were exclusions, but they were typically not along kind of race or sex or geography lines. We find, for example, this is a death notice of Wills Boonu, who was 18 years old, and he lived in this incredibly rural place in Queenstown district with his family members on a farm. And if you go kind of scroll down the kind of entries, you'll find that the causes of death here would be Spanish influenza, and the duration would be 1 month. So that's already kind of curious, because historians of the Spanish flu had believed that this was kind of the 3-day illness. And when we actually calculate across the 40,000 observations, we find that the average duration of illness was kind of much longer, about 2 weeks. So already that kind of changes, just like a small kind of historical fact. But the interesting thing here is that you'll see a blank space next to medical man's name. And that's what we'll actually exploit in this paper, which was ultimately published in World Development. So, we can first, you know these kind of graphs by now, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but you can map out by a town or by district the deaths, the extent of deaths across time. And we do this by race as well. And so in South Africa or in the Cape Colony at this stage, we define 3 race groups. And there's a long kind of explanation about how we do this, but I'm not going to go into that now. But Black, colored, and white residents of the Cape Colony. We then do kind of an analysis, kind of regression analysis, where we want to see what the
multilingualism. But what I thought was really interesting was your talk, the part of your talk.
Was that a question, or should I continue?
Please continue, Johan.
Okay, cool. So we ask, what determines access to medical services? So it's a slightly different question than the kind of classic questions you would get on using these death notices. And the reason we want to ask this is to really get at this question, which became quite apparent during COVID, which was that we observed in contemporary times that people that are typically excluded from medical services, that exclusion or that inequality is exacerbated during pandemics. And so we wanted to know whether this was also true during the Spanish flu. And so what I'll just do now is to give you a sense of, to show you some evidence that this is in fact the case. So we use this medical man's name as a proxy for whether you've got access to medical services. So if a doctor signed here, we code that as yes, you have access to medical services. Of course, it might just be that the doctor might never have seen you actually before you died, but it's a proxy. It's a rough proxy for if there's clearly no entry there, then obviously you had no access to any kind of nurse or doctor before your death. So the question we ask here, what predicts that that a medical man was present at your death? Clearly, race matters. This top right box here is for the characteristics before the pandemic, right? So we analyze death notices between 1915 and 1920. And so this is the typical things that predict whether you've got access to medical services. Clearly, race, if you're white, the reference category is colored, then clearly white residents have more access to medical services. Black residents have worse access. Actually, gender surprisingly has no effect, but literacy seemingly does, and also certain occupations do. The interesting question then is, well, is this exacerbated during a time of pandemic? And what we show is, yes, indeed, the interaction term here during the pandemic is even bigger for being a white resident. So white residents have greater access during the time of pandemic than even during normal times. And again, the black coefficient here is negative. The surprising thing might be that in some occupations, the inequality reverses, right? So that's kind of curious, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. I think this kind of summarizes this entire paper based on, ultimately it's the graph that never made it into the paper, which I was quite sad about. But basically you can see from 1915 to 1920, this is the access to medical services for white females, for white males. So you'll see during the pandemic, there's a slight dip for white males, but not massively so. But then you look at colored females, colored males, and black females and black males. And clearly what you see is during the time of pandemic, well, firstly, the first observation is that there are already big differences in access to medical services before the pandemic. But what you also clearly see is that during the pandemic, you'll see even greater inequalities in access to services. So I think that we were fortunate to be commissioned by the South African presidency to write a report on the Spanish flu. And this was one of the things that we could clearly report, is to say we should be cautious of those groups that are already excluded, because they are likely to face even as greater hurdles when the pandemic COVID hits. So I think I'll conclude here by saying historical microdata has proved for us to be an incredibly valuable tool to uncover histories of people that are often not found in the kind of conventional archival sources. Of course, it requires us to have the kind of funding that allows us to digitize and transcribe these historical sources, and they can be quite expensive. I'm happy to talk about that, but we've tried to use computational OCR techniques. Ultimately, it turns out that a small team of retired librarians provide by far the more superior transcription services. And of course, they must be interpreted within a specific historical context. But I think these types of techniques allow a new generation of that's brave enough to marry the innovative methods of various kinds of social science disciplines, and increasingly also kind of the natural sciences and kind of mathematics and statistics with kind of ambitious historical research questions. So I'll hand over now to Kate to tell us more about the slavery theme of the Biography project.
Thank you very much, Johan.
Great, thanks very much. So as Johan mentioned, I will pick up on the capitalizing on emancipation theme, and I'll speak a bit more about the project, so who's involved in it and what exactly is going on in this theme. And then I will talk a bit about my own research within the Capitalizing on Emancipation group. So firstly, thank you very much, Grant, for the very warm welcome. I was going to say by way of introduction that my work as a historian has focused on slavery in the Indian Ocean world of the Dutch East India Company on the Cape and Sri Lanka. But in the last few years, this has stretched out into the 19th century during the period when the Cape was drawn into the British Empire, and as such was then subject to the new and changing regulations around slave trade, treatment, and then finally around emancipation in the 1830s. So capitalizing on emancipation is one of the themes of the Biography project. As a group, our research agenda really takes as a starting point that emancipation of the enslaved in the Cape Colony brought about a transformation in society. Some historians have likened this transformation in impact to the Mineral Revolution or to the ending of apartheid. So as a research group then, we seek to understand this transformation from slavery to freedom for the enslaved themselves, as well as more generally for the economy of the Cape Colony. So we hope to make a couple of contributions in our work, firstly to the life trajectories of the formerly enslaved and apprentices, secondly to the growing international fields of financial and business history, and thirdly, really to grappling with the legacies of slavery in South Africa. So our work focuses on enslaved people, freed people and apprentices, slave owners, former slave owners, mortgage holders, and on agents or business people involved in this period. So really it's wide in its scope. One of the things that we're aiming to do in terms of chronology is really bridge the divide that is emancipation. So in a lot of work, de jure emancipation in 1834 or de facto emancipation in 1838 is taken as an ending point of studies or as a starting point of studies that then go deeper into the 19th century. And so we're trying to follow chronologies that take a longer view, that keep the slavery and post-slavery periods in the same framework. At the moment, the research group consists of a number of postgraduate students in both history and in economics. So I'll talk a bit about the sources that we are working on as a group. The first is the slave emancipation dataset, which is a compilation of transcribed records. Over many years, these records were transcribed from the Western Cape Archives and Record Services in Cape Town, as well as from the British parliamentary papers. And the slave emancipation dataset includes valuations of enslaved people around the time of emancipation, as well as compensation paid to slave owners and parts of the slave registers for different districts of the Cape Colony. In this data set, we have individual level information on around 36,000 enslaved people on the eve of emancipation. And while the data was created in the 1830s for the purposes of paying out compensation to slave owners, together we can use this very rich source for finding out a lot more about the enslaved population at the time. So this is work that Johan and I were doing together with Lisa Martin and with Hans Hierser, and that's a paper that's in Explorations in Economic History. Then I want to highlight a second source, which Kathryn will pick up on, I'm sure, during her presentation, and that's the newspapers. So some of these have already been digitized en masse, such as the Zuid-Afrikaan, which was first published in April 1830. Others, like the Government Gazette, are not quite as newspapery as the Zuid-Afrikaan is, but was rather the Cape Authority's vehicle for publicizing proclamations and ordinances, but it did also carry news reports and advertisements. So one of the things that we're working on within the group is analyses of advertisements. One aspect of that is enslaved people who were advertised for sale. And so that's a project that's ongoing at the moment. And the other that Kathryn will speak about is advertisements of runaways. And that's Carl Bergman, who I saw joined the meeting earlier. That's really here in Cape Town. And these are the mortgage records. So I'll talk a bit more about the mortgage records in a moment, but these are three of the bodies of sources that we're using. There are others, such as the auction records and an account ledger from one of the firms active at the time, probate inventories, and various other sources. The enslaved in the Cape Colony were considered mortgageable property. So slave owners used enslaved people as collateral on loans. The earliest record of such an agreement dates to 1730. And from that period onward, then we have about 100 years of records of slave mortgages of this kind. It's likely that mortgaging enslaved people existed before 1730 as well, and certainly wasn't unique to the Cape. So I think if we look in Batavia or in Colombo, we'll find similar practices that took place during the Dutch East India Company periods. By the 19th century then, which is the period that I focus on, mortgaging enslaved people was a well-established practice in the Cape Colony, as it was elsewhere in the British Empire, as well as in North America. In the Cape Colony, under British regulations, a separate register of slave mortgages was established in 1818, and that was maintained by the registrar and the guardian of slaves. And it's these records which make up part of the slave office papers in the Cape Archive. To me, they look quite a bit like early spreadsheets. They're organized according to the surname of the debtor, so they're alphabetical records. And the enslaved are, who were committed to these loans are then listed by name, place of origin, as well as place of registration, so place within the colony where they were registered. The value of the loan was included, as well as details of the notary who'd formalized the agreement. The date at which the agreement was cancelled is also noted, but surprisingly, not as often as I had expected. Because the slave owner's claim to ownership over the enslaved person was the foundation of these mortgage records, each of the mortgages then also includes a reference to where that slave owner's slave property was recorded in the slave registers, which are a separate series in the slave office papers. So in the work that I've done on these mortgage records so far, what I see is that the vast majority of the records show agreements between individuals. So an individual lent money to another individual on slave collateral. These were personal credit networks rather than institutional. In the 1810s, there were only 2 banks in the Cape Colony, the recently established government Discount Bank and the slightly older Lombard Bank. Both were controlled by the Cape authorities and accepted slave collateral. There were also a few firms that did the same, as well as some of the societies at the Cape, but the overwhelming majority of mortgages were agreed between individuals. And this was a continuation of an earlier pattern of borrowing and lending to be established in the Cape Colony in the previous century or earlier. I've also found that the practice did not come to an abrupt halt at emancipation in 1834, as I had expected that it would. It continued in 2 ways after emancipation. The first is that agreements that had been made prior to the 1st of December 1834 remained open at emancipation and were only cancelled after emancipation, even though the slave collateral specified on the agreement had ceased to exist as such after Emancipation Day. Secondly, new mortgages were agreed after emancipation, and these were agreed on apprentice collateral. The 4 years of continued labor and the monetary compensation due to slave owners between 1834 and 1838 facilitated slave owners or former slave owners in that period continued access to credit. So earlier studies had already established the similarities between the period of slavery and the 4-year apprenticeship that followed. We see that in the buying and selling of enslaved individuals and apprentices, in the kind of work that they undertook, as well as in experiences of life. So what I've been able to add to that then is the continued use of apprentices, first enslaved people and then apprentices, as collateral on loans. It's clear that some mortgages remained open at emancipation. When the British government paid out compensation, they made a provision to compensate mortgage holders as one of the groups of beneficiaries. Mortgagees were included in the process by filing counterclaims. At the time, many enslaved people were committed to these mortgages, and slave owners were heavily in debt. The newspapers were full of discussions and many anxious letters about how compensation would be paid out, where, when, and how much. And many of the slave owners' expectations was that it would be ruinous to them. In the end, compensation was paid out in London, necessitating the use of agents to remit claims and bring the cash to the Cape Colony, a business from which they profited handsomely. But that is another story that I'm happy to talk about more at a later stage. When we consider the impact of the compensation money which flowed into the colony in 1836 and 1837, I don't think it's a coincidence that we see the proliferation across the districts of the Cape Colony of commercial banks in the immediate aftermath. I'm working on another aspect of the impact of compensation, and this is specifically on Cape Town. Some of the £1.2 million that was set aside for compensation for slave owners and mortgage holders, beneficiaries in the Cape Colony, was paid out to individuals in both capacities, as slave owner and as mortgage holder. One example of this, and I'll just discuss him as an example, is Andries Brink Danielsson. There are other men like him, and I'm happy to elaborate on some of those examples. But preliminary work on the mortgages shows that Brink was among the largest mortgage holders at the time of emancipation. From the work so far, it seems that he held about £9,000 worth of open mortgages in 1834. And this is likely to increase as I continue work on the mortgage records. As a holder of open mortgages, then, he was entitled to compensation. Following on from the work that Robert Ross has done with Lisa Martin, and this was published in the Journal of Southern African Studies last year. They looked at where the formerly enslaved chose to live in Cape Town in the aftermath of emancipation. Picking up on some of the questions that they raised, then Robert Ross and I are working on the city's landlords in the 1840s. The great majority of the city's housing stock was rented out, not owner-occupied, in the early 1840s. In total, 82% of dwellings were rented accommodation, and just under half of the dual-purpose houses were also rented out. What we found from the rate roll of 1842 is that owner-occupied houses in general were worth nearly 2.5 times as much as rented dwellings. We've identified 39 landlords from these rolls who rented out 8 or more properties. And what we find is that the houses that made up their rental portfolio were of low quality. The average value of the houses owned by these largest landlords was £220, which was under half of the mean value of the city's dwellings. Among the largest landlords of the time were Andries Brink Danielsson and the brothers Wicht. Brink rented out 61 properties in 1842, valued at more than £12,500. These properties were concentrated in the Boerkaap and around Kierom Street, with an average value of just over £200 per dwelling. What we see then is the landlord's properties portfolios consisted of low-value properties and were concentrated in specific parts of the city. And this isn't specific to Brink, but we see the same pattern amongst other landlords of the time. So they were not so much just landlords as they were slum landlords. So we were trying to make this connection then between the slum landlords and the mortgage holders. Many years ago, Robert Ross had suggested that compensation money was invested in Cape Town in buildings which the formerly enslaved then moved into after emancipation. We're trying to present evidence of that connection between compensation and the building of Cape Town, which hasn't been shown before. And what we're trying to do is show that it's not so much the compensation money that was paid to slave owners in the late 1830s, but the compensation money that was paid out to the mortgage holders. What we're hoping to demonstrate then is the impact of compensated emancipation on Cape Town in the built environment and in the financial and social relations between the former master class and the formerly enslaved, who in the 1840s became then landlord and tenant. I'm happy to talk about this more, but for now, I will stop here and I'll hand over to Kathryn.
Thank you very much. Kate, Kathryn.
Thank you. I'm just so I'm just trying to get this into presentation mode. Okay, that should work. Can you see my screen? Yeah, you can see my screen? Oh, cool.
Yes, I see your screen. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about our role in this project, which is the interpretation of some of this data as visual art. So our project, which we called Fugitive, is only one of 14 artworks that are all currently part of an exhibition called Charting the Uncharted. And our particular contribution looked at, as Kate has mentioned, adverts placed in contemporaneous publications that advertised for the return of so-called runaways. So I'm very pleased to see in the room both Carl and Pearl, collaborators, who will correct me if I make any factual errors, which will be my own. Any errors and omissions are my own. The work that we produced, Pearl and I did it collaboratively as VisLab, which is Grant very kindly introduced us, is what we call the studio lab that I established in the Department of Visual Arts last year. After returning from the UK, I spent 5 years at FaceLab at Liverpool John Moores University. And we were paired up with Carl as the researcher and essentially received his content with a relatively open brief to interpret this content, which, as we have talked about amongst ourselves subsequently, it's quite an extraordinary act of trust to do that, to let your data loose and have artists do with it what they will. But we produced a visual response to this material. Between October 2021 and February 2022, we've produced 10 depictions, and I will take you through those after a quick introduction to VizLab. For some of you, you may not be familiar with forensic facial imaging or forensic art and how it is currently practiced, but VizLab essentially offers both research and service within the forensic facial imaging field. Our work is targeted at identifying the unidentified, so individuals who are unidentified within the forensic pathology services system. We collaborate, therefore, with that Department of Health, under which that service resorts in South Africa, as well as the South African Police. But we also apply these skills to heritage, archaeology, etc. So one of the images at the bottom of the screen, just next to the image of Pearl and myself, is from the Sutherland Reburial Initiative, which I was one of the members of the research team, and that involved facial reconstruction from the skull. Which is a different process to what we applied in this case. But the point is really that we operate an entirely digital workflow with computer-enabled haptic sculpture. So that device you see in the center of the screen is the haptic device that enables one to produce virtual sculpture with touch feedback, which provides very important information from the object that we're working with. So, in respect of our approach to this project, we decided to use facial compositing techniques to interpret the physical descriptions of these runaways from the textual descriptions in the adverts. So we worked closely with Carl to select a set of adverts that offered the richest possible physical description that we could essentially treat like eyewitnesses. And Pearl has served for over 6 years as a member of the South African Police Service in the facial identification unit. So her job was making facial composites from eyewitness accounts. So we were also interested, though, in thinking about how the forensic facial image relates to portraiture, because we don't consider them portraits, but we're interested in how we might reference the language of formal portraiture as a way to potentially critically intervene in history's representational constructions, as well as the language of forensic images, which implicitly criminalize individuals by virtue of their visual language. We also thought it would be necessary to digitally remediate the original archival source through a number of techniques, which I'll demonstrate now, visual inversions and textual editing. And all of this was really to assert the details of personhood and essentially arrive at ideas of these individuals as individuals rather than objects, assets, as Kate has described. So in responding to the archive, the source material demanded critical remediation. We had concerns about perpetuating the racially and socially biased language contained in the adverts via straightforward reproduction of the source material. So how could we work with it and represent it in a way that pointed to its problematics? We also found it necessary to research quite extensively the social and material culture of the Cape Colony via local museum sources, and a shout out here to Ezeko Social History Museum and curator, Esther, she's amazing. Mainly because there was such a focus on the clothing in these adverts. And I realized that my understanding of 18th and early 19th century fashion was extremely limited. So I needed some good visual references with which to work to produce the images. So there's literally one source that we could find, published in 1975, and that source, Clothing Fashions in South Africa, is pretty limited, but it has its advantages. And just to mention some of these images, which are what we pulled from the archives of the William Fair collection and Ezeko Social History, just might be interesting to note that the image on the top left by Charles Davidson Bell is a watercolor entitled The Schoolmaster Reading De Zuid-Afrikaan. And De Zuid-Afrikaan was one of the sources from which the majority of these, in this initial set of facial depictions have been produced. So in responding to the archive, this is what I was referring to in terms of the textual remediation. So on the left is the original advert, and on the right-hand side is what I did to them to sort of start to alter them a little bit. So they've been literally inverted. If you held up a mirror to the print, you'd be able to read the text, but keeping the salient aspects of these textual sources the right way around, so to speak. So the salient pieces of information that would allow you to know that this person, in this case, was a little boy without a name. It's the only one in this set without an actual name, a given name or a full name, who was 12 years of age, last seen in Cape Town, with a sense of location. So Mulriazicht, opposite the 3 Mile Stone, and then a date. There's much more that can be said about the ads themselves, but I would not hazard to do that. I think that would definitely be Carl's terrain. But furtherly responding to the archive, the facial composites themselves are the result of detailed visual research, looking back at how these runaways have been depicted in other contexts. So in the United States, looking back at all kinds of non-photographic, obviously, because this is largely pre-photographic culture. So drawings, engravings, watercolors, etc. And then constructing a reference database from online sources, in addition to these visual references, and also looking at how other artists have worked with this material to kind of position ourselves within this field. We wanted to desperately avoid producing images that looked like suspects, because obviously these adverts implicitly criminalize these individuals, and also avoiding the visual language of the wanted poster, because the ads do that, but we wanted to do something else. In respect of the affordances of the facial composites, all forensic depictions of whether you make them from the skull or whether you make them in this facial compositing way with visual resource material, they're all facial images produced without a direct visual reference. So you don't have an image of the person of whom you are making a portrait. So there is obviously an element of making things up to a certain extent, but it's very important to know that there are techniques and methodologies behind this work that we justify all of our decisions based on the source material that we're using, whether that's a human remains or other, in this case, verbal statement. And no forensic depictions, contrary to popular belief, have to be 100% accurate to be successful, to do their work. And that's something about them as visual objects that I find extremely compelling. And the images that we've made are obvious constructions, and we've kept traces of that construction in the image to point to the fact that they're constructions, yet they are read as being uncannily real. And that visual paradox or perceptual paradox, I also find very compelling. And then, like I said, the role of clothing in constructing personhood. This is something that I work with in the sort of research and service work I do within the forensic humanitarian action space, but also thinking back to Holocaust museums, the way that clothing objects act as an analog of personhood. And in this case, a really interesting counter-forensic device, we learned that there was very little difference, obviously depending on the status of the individual's master class and slave class. There was very little significant difference between the types of clothing that would have been worn. So I was interested in this idea of the clothing as a counter forensic device, and that it might enable someone to hide in plain view. So this is just going to run as a reel. These are the 10 images which we've produced. They're installed as paired portraits, either side by side with the textual remediation panel and the face, or in a previous installation, mounted back to back and hung suspended down the center of the gallery. and I paid special attention to pulling out the name of the individual from the advert to create the kind of patterning wallpaper in the background of the textual element. So those are the 10. So on some of our reflections on this is that of the 10 faces in the current presentation, 6 are children between the ages of 10 to 11, 14 to 16. 8 of them have given names, and only 2 have names and surnames, and they happen to be the European apprentices, which I thought was interesting. 1 is female, and 1 is an alleged actual criminal in the sense that he probably murdered someone, and the advert speaks to that backstory. And just pointing to that actual criminality versus an implicit criminalization of these individuals as fugitives, which just points to a kind of complexity that emerges when you spend time with these sources. Carl pointed out, which I thought was really interesting, that we'd kind of inadvertently achieved statistical representation in respect of basic biographical demographics such as age and gender. And any further work that we might do with this material will actively consider this. So in respect of the impact and further work, the use of forensic imaging skills in heritage contexts from this project and previous projects I've done has proven very powerful. Carl mentioned that one of the things is that the impact on his own thinking about his own research is that he's reconsidered his use of language, particularly around the fugitive idea. And I was particularly interested in the double meaning of fugitive in the sense that these faces themselves, as much as we are trying to speak to reconstituting personhood, they themselves are fugitive in that they are digital constructions. The faces function in 2 ways. They're simultaneously specific, but they also, as people, visitors to the exhibition have mentioned, they also seem to act as visual placeholders of others not written into history, however imperfectly. People have said that the faces are very familiar to them. They look like people I see on the street. People find them intensely relatable. I constantly ask myself what it is to represent people who lived in a pre-photographic period as hyperrealistic photographic images. That's definitely a conversation for another time. And really interesting idea that came up in a conversation in the gallery the other day, that these adverts almost seem to function as a form of proto-social media. They have a familiarity and an intimacy, and certainly we experience that working with them, but obviously they also speak to processes of objectification. But for us and for those who've experienced the work seems to have given history a face, quite literally, and has presented the received or perceived history of enslavement in a far more complex way. So to thank Johan for invitation, for getting me involved in this, and for Clara for curating a beautiful show, Carl for trusting us with his research, and Esther for some extraordinary support in the visual archive. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much indeed, Johan, Kate, and Kathryn. Each one of your presentations could have filled a very stimulating hour. Formally, we're close to the end of our time. However, our speakers have graciously agreed to stay on for an extra 15 minutes or so. If you have to leave, feel free. If you can stay a little bit longer, that would be wonderful. If there's so much to discuss here, well, to start with, in Cape history, and here I would like to acknowledge my wonderful colleagues, Laura Mitchell, Joe Groenewald, Nigel Worden, and Karen Jennings that are on this call, because we have had our own conversations around some related topics. However, in the interest of this series, I would like to just kick off with a question, perhaps a meta question on the lines of what is your audience for this? Who are you intending most to reach for this? Would it be helpful to distinguish in database projects, and here I'm thinking of the earlier part, between some kind of digital project that essentially provides the footnotes for scholarship that's already produced and published, on the one hand, at one extreme, and on the other hand, putting up a whole lot of material, and there's several libraries that, for example, that do this, waiting for other people to jump in. So, I'm not saying that's a useful dichotomy, but I'm just trying to tease out the question of audience for the very perhaps different parts of your umbrella project.
Thanks, Grant. I think that's a great question. It's a question that we've been thinking about a lot recently, especially given that we are now at the end of the project formally, and what have we achieved basically so far? And so the first thing I think is the initial aim, and I think we've come pretty close to that, is just to make the history profession certainly aware of the benefits of the kind of interdisciplinary methods combining quantitative history, quantitative social science tools with traditional historical approaches, and the benefits that can yield to the history profession itself, right? And so certainly I think there's I hope at least that there is a greater awareness. There's a book that will be coming out next year by Bloomsbury called Quantitative History and the Unaccounted, which is a collection of chapters, 11 chapters, that give a overview of the different kinds of methods that we've used in the project, and hopefully that book will introduce a broader audience of historians, South African historians. But I hope that also, it's a book on kind of Cape Colony history, but it's a book that also hopes to show a broader history audience the benefits of these kinds of tools and methods, approaches. I think the second thing to say is that the exhibit that Kathryn mentioned, Charting the Uncharted, is an attempt to reach an audience beyond the academe. And surprisingly, it's something that I haven't thought about much before, certainly in my career, and I suspect many other academics do not think much about it, right? So, there's no incentive for certainly for me in kind of the economics or history department to think about how do we communicate our research to a broader audience. And it's been incredibly, I mean, Kathryn alluded to this, it's been an incredibly, humbling experience to actually share your work with the kind of general public and see people walk into an exhibit like this and engage with the material. You have to translate the research both to the artists, but now also to a public that asks critical questions about why should we care, and that's been a wonderful experience. And we recently also had a conference where we talked about how do we communicate, data, quantitative output to a broader audience. And again, this was wonderfully interdisciplinary. And that's something that I think we should probably think harder about. And I don't know how to change the incentive system to get my colleagues to think more about this, but this is something that I would certainly want to encourage.
Thank you very much indeed, Johan. Are there any questions, comments? Laura.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Grant and Stefania, for organizing today's conversation, and of course to Johan, Kate, and Kathryn for showing up and talking. It was just really generative for me, and I think a good conversation starter. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about how the availability of source material in particular formats influences who then works with it, right? And Johan, you've been thinking a lot about this as an economic historian who gets to work with data sets, right? And A lot of that for economic historians is about material that's already been collated or that's pretty easily collatable, versus social historians who, disciplinarily are inclined to sit with really small pieces of information and tease out everything we can from them. And so it's a really different thing to think about whether or not you've got, an already digitized run of census records or tax returns or birth records, and what it takes to do the work to dive into those individual records and try and stitch them back together, whether you're doing that digitally or manually. And, I think that I'm not really sure how to frame the question that's here, which is about disciplinarily who's inclined to pursue which kinds of material and what that does to shape the kinds of work that comes out.
I think I'm going to give Kate also 2 minutes to answer this, but let me just, one of the main ambitions I had before starting this project, and probably, Laura, the one that I've failed at, to certainly in my ambition, was that I really had hoped to attract a larger interest from history students. So the interest is certainly there, but the ability to then ultimately use these sources in a way that tell these what I think is fascinating new insights, give us fascinating new insights into these histories it's a big step. It's a big challenge for many of these students. We've held several workshops, but ultimately I'm increasingly of the view that the only way that this can happen sustainably is if quantitative history tools are taught at the undergraduate level, and students are exposed to this beyond just a week long or a weekend long workshop, and it must be kind of part of the reading material. And there are wonderful tools out there. So there's two French historians, Claire Lemassier and Claire Zalk, who wrote a wonderful text, an accessible text, where they make the claim that it's they adopt many of the tools of the kind of economic historians, but actually economic historians' tools are also pretty limited. Actually, there's within social science, political science, there are wonderful techniques that are exploratory, and their claim is specifically to make quantification fun, right? To play around with it, to look at the outliers rather than the kind of averages. And so I think there are ways to do this, but I'm not sure I succeeded in the 5 years of this project to really get at that. And so the one thing I have done now is to turn this book that we're compiling, that will be published next year, also into 13 undergraduate lectures. So at least there will be a toolkit that if South African historians would want to use this, use some of this material in their classes, that they would have access to slides and kind of the methods that underlie this. But Kate, I'm not sure if you want to add to this specifically in terms of slavery.
Yes, thanks, Johan. Yeah, I think specifically when it comes to studying slavery, to studying enslaved people in the Cape Colony, I think being able to find those really small pieces of information that you mentioned, Laura, and piece a number of them together across different sources is, firstly, it's incredibly difficult, but it's incredibly rewarding. And so when it comes to large data sets in which you've got potentially thousands of named individual enslaved people, you can start finding the same person more than once in different places. And that can happen within sources, but across sources as well. And so I hope that as we all within the Capitalizing on Emancipation group and beyond the group continue working on this diverse group of sources, that we'll be able to find enslaved people who might be named in multiple places. And then if we can find something like a court record, of course, then we have a whole lot more to work with. But even without that, I think being able to trace enslaved people across these different sources will be really, really valuable. And I'm starting to see some of that across different records that I'm working on at the moment, which have mortgaging as the connection. And of course, one of the things that's really problematic about this is that the way that the enslaved were recorded is often organized by the slave owner. But being able to trace slave owners then also gives us more opportunity to trace enslaved people. So we can also subvert that way of recording.
Thank you, Kate. Richard?
Thank you for this wonderful set of presentations. And I just want to say that I want to have one question for you that comes out of the research that we're doing on slavery and emancipation in Senegal. And that has to do with the ethics of naming names. So one of the fascinating things that you have is this project to promote personhood. And that includes naming names to humanize these former slaves. But in Senegal, where the end of slavery is more recent, there still is stigma attached to this. So how do you handle the ethical dilemma of naming names to give personhood to enslaved people, to former enslaved people, but yet to protect their identity from the stigma that might be there? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. Thank you. I'm not sure I'm fully qualified to answer this, but I can sort of reflect on my feelings about working with this material and the questions that I had about naming names and the accuracy of these names. So I was curious about whether, and I had this experience with the Sutherland project, and this was a different group of people whose bones had been taken out of graves in an area in the Karoo and given to the University of Cape Town's medical school. And there were archival records associated with some of those individuals that enabled the university to trace them to descendant families still living in that area. But we could see there that those names were given to those people, not by their parents or their people. So they were what I refer to as received names. And in this particular set that we worked on, like I mentioned, the one child was just referred to as little boy, but only the two European apprentices had full names, William Munns and Thomas Riley. And the others were names that, when I look at a whole selection, and Carl could maybe speak to this in more detail, the names repeat, but they're not necessarily the same people. So they're a set of relatively common names that keep popping up. In terms of the ethics, that is an interesting question, because I have my own anxieties about this kind of imaging, and knowing also its history, and what it's been applied to, and the sense that these kinds of images, if these were black and white images and presented in a different kind of composition, it would refer straight back to that kind of wanted poster. So handling the kind of visual presentation of these faces for us was a very, very sensitive thing that we thought about for a very long time. And we hope that they've landed well. They seem to have, in terms of how they've been received, certainly locally. And we figured that a South African audience would be a really tough crowd. So, in this respect, so we're pretty happy with it. But I don't know if Carl wanted to say anything else about the names.
Carl dropped off.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add 1 minute that I think that there's a real demand for, at the moment, certainly, for more information, more kind of it's kind of a deep desire for more almost genealogical information about slave ancestors. And so in that sense, I think the demand for information about your family, your ancestry, trumps the questions about the slave association. That's certainly the experience that I have in speaking to people that would be considered kind of descendants of the enslaved. I think the real urge for just more information, things that were covered up for a long time and now becomes accessible. I think that's really where the project like this can add a lot of value. We haven't yet made the data set available online, but that is certainly something that we would want to do as part of this process of giving people access to information that for a very long time had not been accessible, even to someone that were kind of curious about their ancestors, would have struggled to find any information. And so I think that's really where I would position their kind of ethics on this.
Laura?
Yes, thanks, Grant. And jumping in to continue the conversation with Richard, I think there's really different politics in Senegal and in South Africa. Not that people in South Africa are dying to claim their enslaved ancestry or slave ancestors, but rather that for a lot of communities in South Africa that have likely descended from formerly enslaved peoples, there isn't good genealogical data to link specific people today to specific slave ancestors. So the stigma is more generalized, I think, and is something that contemporary South Africans are, in my view, continuing to wrestle with. And I think you're asking a really interesting question about what that means to say to a community or about a community generically, we know there are slave ancestors here, or to say to a family, your enslaved ancestor is this person.
Thank you, Laura. I think a sense of wanting much more is a great compliment to the speakers, and that is absolutely my sense. Thank you very much indeed, Kathryn, Kate, and Johan, for a fascinating set of presentations. You've raised such wonderful questions. I do very much hope that we can, in one way or another, develop the conversation further. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much.